Hi chefeteers, welcome and thank you for joining me today. Today we're going to talk about the effect that altitude has on what you do in the kitchen. So all of the chefate recipes are developed right here in Denver. So if you are here in Denver cooking, you do not need to make adjustments, you are just good to go. Now if you are using recipes from sea level, you may need to adjust those recipes, and today we'll talk about how and why you need to adjust them. So the reasons why cooking and baking will be different depending on your location comes down to climate and atmospheric pressure. So a lot of the climates at higher altitudes tend to be drier, right? The air is not as humid. Our environment strives for equilibrium. So the less moisture in the air, the more moisture the air will draw out of your food in order to try and make them equal. So this will affect your doughs. You may need to add more liquid than the recipe calls for if you are using a sea level recipe. Also, after you remove your items from heat, let it cool, right? You never want to cover anything too quickly, or else the condensation between your food and whatever you covered it with can create a slimy surface. So let it cool, but once it's cool, if you are in a drier climate, get it covered as quickly as you can, and use materials that are not very breathable. So if you are in a very humid place, a tea towel may be fine. But if you are here in Denver, think about using something less porous. You could go with plastic wrap, or if you're looking for more sustainable options, maybe a silicone bag or beeswax wraps. This is a beeswax wrap, and it has a slightly sticky surface. You warm it in your hand to make it more moldable, and then you can wrap an item in it and kind of seal it. And then once you're done, once you're ready to eat it, you just take this wrap and wash it in cold water, and you can reuse it. Really, the biggest contributing factor to why we need to adjust recipes is because of the atmospheric pressure. So this has two big implications. One is with any leavening. So especially chemical leavening, but really any leavening is going to be more effective at high altitude. And that is because you have less atmospheric pressure pushing down, right? So that leavening is more free to expand into bigger bubbles. It doesn't have as much pressure pushing it back down. And the second is that water boils at a lower temperature, therefore it will evaporate away at a lower temperature. So at sea level, water boils at 212 degrees. Here in Denver, it will boil around 202 degrees. That's a 10-degree difference. And the higher up you go in altitude, the lower that temperature will go. Now that we've talked about the broad why different recipes cooked in different altitudes will yield different products, now let's talk about how you can start adjusting your formulas. And we're gonna go with, we have a sea level formula that we want to make at high altitude here in Denver. And those are the guidelines I will give you. So just be thinking in that, like maybe you have an auntie in Florida who's sending you a recipe for a cake, but you wanna make it here in Denver. So the chemical leavening and the effect of atmospheric pressure on leavening is very important in baking. It doesn't come into effect much for cooking, but in baking it is very important. So as I said before, the chemical leavening is really where you will see the biggest impact of that. Chemical leavening is baking powder or baking soda, and many cookies and cakes that we make are chemically leavened products. So we're gonna start by looking at the quantities of your ingredients. Now this is another wonderful reason why you should get in the habit of using a digital scale over cups, because whenever we adjust these ingredients, we're gonna be going down by 40% or 15%, and it's not as easy to measure 40% of 1 teaspoon as it is to just take what was half an ounce and make it 0.2, 2/10 of an ounce. I hope that math is right. So if you have a recipe that is already in ounces, as you're doing this math, it's gonna go a lot quicker. It's not impossible to do if you have tablespoons, teaspoons, and cups. It's just gonna save some time if it's already in that 1 standard ounce measurement. So the first ingredients to look for are baking powder and baking soda. Decrease those by 40%, right? We said that there's less atmospheric pressure, and so the leavening is able to do its job more freely, which means you don't need as much in your formula. In addition to that, you can slightly decrease your sugar and add a little bit more moisture. So here you have both the climate and the fact that water boils at a lower temperature working against you to dry out your products. So go ahead and increase that moisture by about 15%. And you may eyeball this and just say, oh, an extra splash of water or milk or any sort of moisture that may already be in the recipe. So if I'm telling you to decrease the chemical leavening, decrease the sugar, and increase the moisture, why do cake mixes have a note that says at higher altitude, add flour? Well, that's because by adding the flour, you are in effect diluting the leavening that is in there. And as we look at those percentages, the leavening going down by 40% is the largest percentage, so that means that's, if we can only control one thing, that's the one to go for. Also, I believe many cake mixes, box mixes will say add flour and add moisture. So you are adding in that moisture. If you do not adjust your recipe, if you say, you know what, I'm just gonna bake it and see what happens. So what you may see is a more coarse crumb structure. Okay, so you can see a slight difference in the crumb structure here. See from the outside, even just in diameter, the difference. This one was adjusted for high altitude and this one was not. And you can see this one kind of looks more biscuity. The non-adjusted one is taller because the chemical leavening was able to balloon up. That crumb structure will be more coarse whenever you have not decreased the chemical leavening. That happens again because as chemical leavening has its little reactions, it's creating bubbles, and then those bubbles grow. And with less atmospheric pressure, those bubbles can grow bigger and bigger. And that will leave you with a more coarse texture. The other thing that can happen with that is sometimes those bubbles will get so big and there's not enough flour in the formula to create structure around those bubbles. And so it's like a balloon that you've blown too big and it's just gonna pop and then sink back in. So your cake will sink in. Pull the cakes out of the oven and it just sinks in the middle. It's because you had too much chemical leavening and the structure of the cake wasn't able to support all of the air that had been worked into that batter. Another textural difference you may notice is a dry and crumbly texture. That coarseness in the crumb can translate to a crumblier and drier seeming texture to begin with. Also, your product has lost more moisture here at high altitude, and so it can truly dry out also. So products will take longer to bake or cook here at high altitude, and so that means that the outside of your products will dry out quicker than they would at sea level, and they could get very dry before the middle of your product is cooked through. And that is what we want to avoid by, in this case, adding more moisture. Another difference that you may see whenever you are baking a sea level cake at high altitude is it may stick in the pan. That is because with losing more moisture, your sugar content is becoming more concentrated. Sugar gets sticky when it gets hot, and that's what is not wanting to release from the pan. So that is why I recommend decreasing the sugar in your formula. That way, as the moisture is evaporated, the sugar doesn't become too concentrated. All right, awesome. That's most of what you need to know when it comes to baking. Reduce your chemical leavening by 40%, decrease your sugar by 10%, and increase that moisture by 15%. So what about cooking? Yeah, of course there's a difference in baking, but in cooking, if you're not using chemical leavening, does it really matter? The temperature that water evaporates at is very important for cooking and for adjusting your cooking times in your savory kitchen. If you were born and raised in Denver or another city at high altitude, you have just cooked the way that you've cooked and probably never thought about how it might be different if you go to sea level. And if you moved from a lower altitude place to a higher altitude place, and it's been several years, you've probably made these small adjustments without even realizing what you were doing. The adjustments needed for cooking are much more minor and more intuitive than some of the baking adjustments. But typically, things will take longer to cook in a higher altitude kitchen. And that stems from water cannot hold as much heat in Denver. So let's look at two pots of water. One of them is at sea level and one of them is in Denver. So the sea level pot will start to boil at 212 degrees. The Denver pot will start to boil at 202 degrees. You dump pasta into each of those pots. Well, that pasta is at room temperature, so about 75 degrees, we'll say. And it's going to take longer for it to cook whenever it's only sitting in 202 degrees instead of 212 degrees. Cooking, like the actual cooking part, is all about transferring heat from one material to another in a desired way. And so with this boiling water, the 212 degrees has more heat available to give the pasta. Whereas the 202 degrees, that's 10 degrees. That's 10 degrees worth of heat that the Denver pasta doesn't get. And that's why that pasta will take longer to cook. Now, that's a wet method of cooking, and that's your pasta isn't going to like dry out more because it's surrounded by the moisture. But what about when you aren't boiling things? So now let's talk about cooking chicken on a skillet, let's say. So muscle meat is about 75% water. There's a lot of moisture in that meat. Again, here in Denver, that is only going to get up to 202 degrees before it evaporates away, and so that water is going to be transferring the heat up until 202 degrees. At sea level, that water is going to be transferring the heat up until 212 degrees. So it's going to be able to cook quicker. So what do you need to do here in Denver? One thing I recommend that is beneficial no matter where you are is make sure that your meat is room temperature or pretty close to room temperature before you apply it to heat. That is important because if you think about a chicken breast starting at 35 degrees straight from the fridge, and it needs to get up to 165 degrees in order for it to be cooked through and healthy to eat, that's 130 degrees that it needs to move. Whereas if you've let your chicken breast get up to, we're going to say 75 degrees for easy math, 75 degrees to 165 degrees, that's not as big of a gap that you need to cover. And as that chicken breast is on the skillet, right, the heat is here at the surface, and then through heat transfer through that water, it's going to make its way into the middle. But that takes time. And so the longer that the surface of the chicken is on the skillet, the drier it's going to get. So if you can shorten this time, this temperature that the chicken needs to get through, then you're going to be helping yourself to prevent so much of that drying out from happening. Another thing you can do is you can cover your pan with a lid And when you do that, don't touch it. Just let it be. Don't keep taking the lid off and poking and prodding and flipping and moving. If you're gonna put a lid on it, keep it on there to keep that heat and that moisture in, because as soon as you remove that lid, the humid air that's surrounding the chicken is gonna be gone, and you're gonna lose a lot of heat that way also. So, you know, you keep that lid on as a way to create an environment to cook the chicken, not just from the hot surface touching the skillet, but also from the air around it. Keep that lid on. So if you have just arrived in a high altitude area and you find that as you're cooking your meat, it seems to get really dry and tough, think about creating the best environment to prevent the meat from drying out. Know that it's gonna take longer to cook. It's okay that it's gonna take longer to cook. Right, just be patient. Now, to know that your meat is thoroughly cooked in the middle and has reached its safe internal temperature, you should use a thermometer to check that temperature. Ice water will always be 0 degrees Celsius. It will be 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you calibrate your thermometer, you always want to use ice water. All right, so fill a glass with ice and then put water around it and stir, 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 stir. And you can stir it with a fork or spoon or knife or something, or you can stir it with the stick of your thermometer, which is what I'm doing here. And then make sure that the thermometer is truly in the middle of the glass, not over on the side, because there will be some heat transfer here. You want to make sure that it's right in the middle and that your glass of water is full, you know, is very full with ice, and then you should be getting 32 degrees. If you aren't, then check the instructions for your specific thermometer to figure out how to calibrate it back so that right in the middle of ice water, it measures as 32 degrees. All right, so the next time that you get a friend or family member from sea level sharing a recipe with you, you know which adjustments need to be made in order for that product to turn out well here in Denver. And be prepared, it may not be perfect the first time, but that's the fun in baking and cooking, is you try it once, you taste it, you find out what your personal preference says needs to be changed, and then you try again. That's the fun process, and whenever you understand a little bit more about the science behind the baking and cooking, then you have more tools to make those adjustments on your own. Thank you for joining me today and allowing me to nerd out on baking science. Join us next time. We will talk again soon. Bye.